Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to what is now the fourth in our series of seminars in the Network Ed seminar series. I'm Steve Ryan, Director of the Centre for Learning Technology, and this afternoon it's my great pleasure to introduce David White. David works in the overlapping space between education, academia and technology. Sounds good. He co-manages a technology-assisted lifelong learning project at Oxford University and does a lot of other things as well. In 2010, David led a study of UK online learning for HEFCE's Online Learning Task Force and continues to research what motivates learners to engage with the web based around his visitors and residents principles. He's going to be talking on a topic related to that this afternoon. The title of his topic is I Knew That the Internet Wouldn't Give Me a Wrong Answer. Before handing over to David, I would like to say that as usual we're experimenting with technology in this event. So you'll see there's a Twitter fountain over to my left, your right. Please do contribute, please do add comments as we go along. And we're also going to be streaming this event, and we're trying to stream it using wireless. So it may not be quite as good a quality as before, but who knows. Okay, enough of technology, and without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dave White.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me along. Okay, you're kind of that. Everybody's opted for that side of the room for some reason. So if the live stream is working, I'm facing that way for a reason, okay? Because that's where the people are. So yes, I think in terms of the format, we've got a reasonable amount of time. I was actually told that I could take as long as I liked, but I won't do that because that would be just mean. I'm actually going to take a certain amount of time. But what I'd say at the start is that because we're not in a huge hurry in that we've got more than 20 minutes, if you do want to stop me and ask me a question or refute virulently what I'm saying, then please do, because it kind of works better if we have a discussion as we go along. It's that kind of a talk rather than necessarily at the end. So I actually mean that. I know that people say that, but I actually mean that. Do shout out. So, I knew that the internet wouldn't give me a wrong answer. Before I plough into the talk, I'll tell you where I sort of come from in terms of my work. I co-manage a unit called Technology Assisted Lifelong Learning, or TALL for short. And I always think, which is an unfortunate acronym, I always think that it's an unusual name because it sort of comes from a time, it was started in 1996, so it comes from a time when CD-ROMs were still around, which is why it doesn't say online or web. That's why it exists like that. And we create and deliver quite a lot of fully online distance courses. Most of them are at undergraduate level 4, so first year undergraduate level. And they're short courses that anybody can come on. So at any given time, there will be over 1,000 students on those courses. And they're in what we call an the Oxford model, but basically what it means is that there's no more than 30 students to each tutor online. We deliver them in Moodle. And a lot of the activity is forum-based, asynchronous, because we've got people from all over the world. We also put on blended courses and courses that are at sort of postgrad level and master's level as well. The other thing that we do, and that I'm heavily involved in, is research into where technology meets learning, or vice versa, depending on what you think the emphasis should be, at a higher education level. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes out of a study that we've been doing called the Digital Visitors and Residents Project, which is funded by JISC, okay? And that's looking in very broad terms as to what motivates learners to engage with the web. That's the sort of perspective of the project. And it uses this visitor and residence idea, which I'll go through in the middle of the talk. How many, just in terms of hands up, how many of you would say that you sort of use technology in a learning context regularly, either with students or obviously for yourselves? I'm assuming everybody Googles occasionally. Yes, so that's a ridiculous question. So most of you kind of tuned into these kind of issues. I think the perspective I'm coming from is that we're taking a very broad view. So we're sort of discovering the kind of things that learners are doing out there on the web. So it doesn't particularly have an institutional focus in that sense, but we want to try and get an understanding of what's going on out there so that we can make recommendations as to where institutions kind of place themselves relative to the culture of the web, relative to what's going, the kind of things that learners are actually doing out there, because we don't necessarily have that good an idea about that at the moment. So one of the important distinctions that I think it's worth making to begin with is this sort of splitting out the idea of academia and teaching and learning. I think sometimes, especially when we talk about technology and learning, we don't separate these things out, and the debate can become a little bit confused. So what I'm thinking of here is that academia is the kind of industry or the mechanism of academia, that kind of almost like career, if you like, whereas teaching and learning is, we hope, not entirely separate, but actually a different subject. A lot of what I'm talking about is actually to do with teaching and learning, not academia, okay? So I think that helps to, you know, separate out the territory. So I knew the internet wouldn't give me a wrong answer. That comes from a student. The project that I was referring to is actually US-UK. So this comes from a US student, and we've been talking to students, we've been interviewing learners from late-stage secondary school or high school, all the way up through to experienced researchers and academics. We split it into these 4 educational stages, I call them. And the first one's called the emerging stage, and that's actually late-stage secondary school and early first-year university, because I was kind of interested in that transition between those sort of 2 forms of education. I think historically, certainly in this country, we've almost imagined that these students are 2 different species, when in actual fact, for a lot of people, it's only a few months between those 2 forms of education. And to be fair, I've got to be fair to, no, that's a UK student. To be fair to UK S4, they were talking about finding a train time. So perhaps I've been a little bit naughty about that. They weren't like searching for the answer to the life, the universe and everything. It was just a piece of admin in that sense. But what I want to explore is where that kind of, I mean, that's an extreme end of that opinion, but I want to explore where that idea comes from, that the internet wouldn't give me a wrong answer, and how it comes about and what it means for us in a higher education institution. So I'm going to hit you with a big slab of data there, okay, so that you're convinced that I'm actually doing a research project. So let me explain what this is. This is the area of our code book. So we've done a number of interviews with people at different educational levels, US, UK. And we've coded up those transcripts. And this is the area of the code book which we call agency, or its elements of it. So what we're doing is we're trying to tag up our data based on what we feel was the motivation for that learner to go to the web. Okay, so as I say, it's motivation to engage. We're not really collecting, you know, we're not really going to people and saying, do you use Facebook, do you use Moodle, do you use Google? We're trying to get sort of behind that. And what you can see here is the larger the square and the greener the square, apologies if you're red-green colourblind, but you can go by the size of the square, the more it is in our data. Okay, and it's fair to say that no matter which educational stage you slice this by, convenience is always at the top. Okay, so convenience in terms of the way that people engage with the web for learning actually sort of trumps relevance, authority, quality. It's just incredibly convenient because the network is everywhere. Okay, so that's the first thing that we see. I think that what's interesting beyond that is that, again, whichever way you slice this data, connection and sharing with others and collaborate are then quite high. Now we are asking people about how they engage with technology in a personal context as well as an institutional context, which probably pushes that a little bit higher, but not necessarily. I think I'm really pleased that we've got in our codebook the difference between sharing and collaborating. Okay, so often I think that we confuse those, or we conflate those 2 things. It's actually really difficult to effectively collaborate with anybody, anywhere, whether that's online or offline. But in terms of the web, it's relatively straightforward to sort of make a connection with someone and share something with them. But whether you, I mean, what you think the distinction between those 2 things are, I mean, would be up for debate. But I think it's important to recognise that there's a difference between hanging around and sharing and actually collaborating more specifically on a particular goal online. And then the other interesting thing, again, speed and convenience are probably linked. There's some interesting stuff going on in terms of authority and relevance and reliability, and that tends to be to do with information sources. Okay, but I think that one of the things that the web's doing is it's kind of shifting these sort of the way that we value things in terms of authority and relevance. So, for instance, the younger students, so those who are still of a school age, were really interested in the quantity of information that came back. And if there was too little or too much, they'd quite often go to another source. So if you like, for a lot of them, one of the things that made a source of information relevant and of value was how much there was of it. Okay, that's one of the criteria. So, when we're undertaking these interviews, one of the first questions we ask is, I think it's the second question we ask actually, we say, what kind of, and we don't phrase it in exactly this way, but we're essentially saying, what kind of strategies do you have when you go to the web for learning? Do you have any processes, any systems you use? And more often than not, or quite often, we get this answer, okay? That's not uncommon, okay? We don't always get that answer. Sometimes we get a different answer. This is from a different participant. There we go. So I think it's fair to say that people go to Google and they start there. Now, their system might change and might become more sophisticated as they go up through those educational stages, but that still remains largely true, especially if you're starting out in a new subject area. And I suppose if I was to go back to here, you know, that's because of that convenience block. The reason that people's strategy when it comes to learning in the web is because it works and it's incredibly convenient. And one of the things I'd say is there's no point in fighting that necessarily. We just have to kind of accept that that's the case and find ways of working with it. And this comes from a report that comes out of the Berkman Center, and it's actually around youth and digital media. It's called From Credibility to Information Quality. The research that's going on into sort of youth culture and the web is actually really fascinating and a really good way of getting to grips with what's going on in terms of incoming students, in terms of practices. Because I think that what happens is that these kind of larger cultural and social practices gradually kind of leak into more of a learning space. So I find these kind of reports quite useful. And obviously what's being said here is that the notion of what makes information credible is shifting around and is no longer an absolute. And this report, which is effectively a huge lit review of all the literature in the area, is basically saying that most of us implicitly use what it describes as adult normative way of assessing whether information is valid or relevant, and that has to do with whether the provenance of the information, whether it comes from what we think of as a reliable source. But for a lot of people out there, that's not the case. There are all sorts of different criteria that make a source credible. So what I'm trying to say is it's shifting around, and that's the truth of the matter out there, if you like. Whatever your opinion might be from the perspective of an academic institution, and I'm sure opinions differ. What's interesting, and I think that this is the interesting area if we're talking about getting to grips with this, both in terms of research and in terms of practice, is not getting hung up on tool use. Okay, so when we think about things like digital literacy, quite often we end up focusing on it in terms of the way that our learners engage with technology, with the technology being a tool, if you like, something that they use as a tool. But in actual fact, I mean, this is my opinion, if you can Google, then you immediately shift out of the problem being how to learn the computer as a tool to needing to actually engage in terms of critical literacies and critical thinking, the ability to evaluate sources, okay? So you don't need to be, I mean, to put it bluntly, you can be incredibly low tech and find yourself in an enormous information environment. And I think that that's what's changed over the last few years. And what's interesting to me is how the the students that are least equipped to cope with being in this information jungle are the ones that are in the largest space. So if we imagine that students who are sort of 11 through to 15, 16, 17, they're just hitting Google and Wikipedia. So they are in this huge information space, and yet they might not be being equipped with the kind of critical literacies to be able to cope with being out there. Then, as you progress through what I'll loosely call your academic career, as you go up through those academic stages, your information environment actually gets smaller, not bigger, because you start to narrow down your starting point. So what we see, roughly, and this is something that I need to look into in more detail, is you're going to start with Google, Wikipedia, those kind of sources. You'll have your textbook, you'll have syllabus-based websites, and then you start to see this shift towards things like Google Scholar and Google Books, the library catalogue. And then obviously, as you become more specialised in your discipline, you narrow your search down even more, and you're going to specific catalogues or specific journals or specific bits of the library. So it's almost like everything's upside down. And my point of view on this is that the kind of critical evaluation skills that traditionally you'd be teaching at maybe second year undergraduate level should actually in some ways need to start being taught to 12-year-olds. I mean, I don't know how you go about doing it, but that's the environment they're in the jungle, and then your information environment potentially gets more. Now, what I'm not saying that when you get to, you know, postgraduate level, you stop Googling. You're carrying on doing everything all the way through the stack. But the stuff that's really critical to you is actually in a smaller information environment. You're going to a smaller and smaller chunk of the library or the digital space, okay? So where does an idea like that come from? Because that's quite widely held. There's an Ofcom report, which I can't remember the name of the actual report, that came out late last year. And 33% of 11 to 15-year-olds believe that a website wouldn't be in a search engine unless it was true. Do you see, so you're dealing with these kind of opinions. Now, that can't be right, obviously, but there's this cultural expectation, and I think the next 33%, or quite a large percentage, said it might be true. Do you see what I mean? But these are the incoming students, okay? So we have this is what I'm trying to get at, is this cultural shift in how the authority and the validity or the credibility of information is being sort of seen or evaluated. And whether you think that's right or wrong, I think it's happening, and so we need to respond accordingly. So, are there any questions or any points anybody wants to make about that first section? You're all looking at me, yes.
Something that came up on Twitter, I don't know if you've covered this in the interim, but she said, is there a difference?
Oh.
Just for the street. Okay, sorry.
Yes, just something that came up on Twitter. Someone asked, Natasha asked, is there any distinction between HE and FE students in your studies?
We don't go into that much detail, unfortunately. I mean, I'd like to, but I think it's fair to say that the study at the moment is taking a very broad level view, and then we're drilling into it. So at the moment, I can't honestly answer that question. What I would say is that people's kind of learning or digital literacies don't change significantly as you might imagine when they perhaps shift from school to university, or even as they move up through university. So people tend to develop relatively blunt approaches, and as long as they work, they stick with them. So I can't answer the question specifically, but as a general point, I'd say I don't see massive variation across, say, late stage secondary school, first year university or second year university. Okay. Shall I move on, or is there any other thoughts there? I'm sure you'll shout out. And then there'll be that delay where you have to wait for the microphone. Okay, so how many people, hands up again, have heard of the idea of digital natives and digital immigrants? A few of you. Okay, most of you. So I will explain it very, very quickly. So in about 2001, a guy named Mark Prensky came up with this idea that if you are if you've grown up with digital technologies all around you, you're kind of native to them, and you almost operate in them as if they were your first language. Whereas if you're a bit older and you have to learn those technologies as an adult, then you're always going to be operating almost in a second language. It's kind of a metaphor of language. There's a few interesting things about it. One is that he came up with that metaphor pre-social media, really. It was actually around gaming. It was around learning and gaming, but people used it. People applied it to social media. And unfortunately, what it ended up coming to mean was that old people just don't get this stuff. Do you see what I mean? That's what people sort of appropriate. And the way that I see it is it became, everybody loves a generation gap, if you like. So people were quite comfortable with the idea that younger people were really good with technology and that we were all dinosaurs, okay? Now, the situation is much more nuanced than that, and there's been a reasonable amount of research that refutes the idea of natives and immigrants, and certainly what we're finding refutes it as well, in the sense that I think that what's happened is technology has shifted from being a kind of tech, I don't know how best to put it, it's basically shifted out of geekland into being more of a kind of lifestyle product. So again, my opinion is that younger people who appear to be good with technology, quite often they're just consumers of technology rather than they're consuming it like a product, if you like, rather than necessarily using it. So we've got plenty of it. I'll go on and talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but just to talk about visitors and residents. So to propose an alternative to that idea of natives and immigrants, which was overall a little bit damaging, because what it did was it gave us a reason to not talk to students about their learning practices with technology, because we just said, oh, they're all brilliant, if you see what I mean. So there's around about a decade of students that I think sort of got left out in the cold. I proposed this idea of visitors and residents, which is a kind of a continuum from the visitor to the resident. And I'll explain what they are in a second. What I'd like to say about it, though, is that it's about kind of genres of participation. So this idea of genres of participation I think is really useful. And again, it comes from digital youth research, which comes from Berkeley. And the point about it is that it's not a framework, okay? So there's a lot of really good framework digital literacy stuff going on out there at the moment in terms of developing ways that we can sort of facilitate learners in their digital literacy skills. There's quite a lot of institutions that are actually coming up with graduate attributes which are around digital literacy. So, you know, by the time you leave our institution, you will be capable of being influential in online communities. So, and some of these are quite wild, these graduate attributes, in terms of, I don't know how you'd go about doing that, but they're quite lofty. So this is not a framework particularly, because obviously the danger with a framework is that you have this idea of kind of progression. I mean, we're very sort of wired to the idea of progression in education, as if you could kind of become a black belt in digital literacy or something and then you've finished, all right? The genres of participation is about, as I say, motivation to engage in a given context, all right? And I'll sort of fill this in a little bit here. So, these aren't two different people. These are genres of participation, all right? And one is not better than the other, and most people are a blend of these things, all right? So the visitor, I can't say that, can I? The visitor genre of participation, of which some people operate in certain contexts, and this is the problem with the language, it just gets a bit wordy. But anyway, a visitor mode of engagement is somebody who's quite goal-orientated, usually. They see the web like a kind of untidy toolbox, okay? So they figure out what they want to achieve, they open the toolbox, they rummage around for the tool they want to use, they use it, they put it back in the toolbox, they go offline and close the lid, okay? So that they can be highly effective and highly efficient, but they don't necessarily, they kind of disappear. They're not really particularly visible online. They don't necessarily have a persona online that you can find. So they won't necessarily be a really visible member of a social networking site or something like Facebook, okay? So they're using the web as a tool. They think of the web as a series of tools. Whereas the resident, as you'd imagine from the metaphor, lives out part of their life, a portion of their life online to a greater or lesser extent, okay? So they see the web as a place, not necessarily as a series of, they predominantly see it as a place. So, and by place, I mean somewhere where there are other people, okay? So they're interested in the idea of projecting their identity into that place. They're interested in expressing opinions, having discussions, meeting other people. They're interested in that idea of presence, okay? So they're liable, well, they're almost guaranteed to have, say, something like a Facebook account. They might be on Twitter. They might blog, although that's unlikely, but they might feel comfortable about commenting on blogs, for example. Okay, so the web is a series of places where you meet people, and then you can go from this area of the web to another, meet another, and they'll be members of different communities. Okay, so that's the big distinction, the kind of tools place. And once you start thinking about the web as a place, it opens up a whole different sort of series of ideas and different approaches, especially when we think about it in terms of learning. Now, actually, that looks quite complicated now. I look at it now. It's not as complicated as it looks, honestly. So what we can do with our data, and this is a participant UKU3, so that's somebody who's first or second year undergrad based in the UK. We could take the transcript of, and this is very handcrafted, okay? So I'm not going to be doing this with lots of our participants, but it's just interesting to see. We can take our transcript and we can plot it against the visitor-resident continuum, and we've also put this kind of personal and institutional line in, because we're asking them in quite broad terms about what they're doing with technology. And each of those blocks represents a kind of significant chunk of the transcript where we thought they were saying something of value that's plottable. And this is not an entirely atypical sort of scenario here, where you've got a lot of activity that's of a resident style. So this is something to do with Facebook up here, okay, and this maybe is something to do with Skype. You've got a lot of resident style engagement in that personal quadrant, and then when it comes to the institutional engagement, it tends to be very visitory, and you can kind of imagine why that might be. And it's possible to be a highly successful student using that visitor mode of engagement. Okay, it's efficient and it works well. And generally speaking, what our pedagogy requires of students is a fairly visitor sort of engagement in terms of the direct curriculum. I mean, you can draw the idea. You can draw the idea so that it's much larger, and you can say, oh, actually, you know, we're a campus-based institution, and so the students are kind of physically resident, and they might be part of clubs and societies, etc., which is fine, which is good, obviously. But online, quite often we see this sort of split. So what's interesting is that certainly if you work in the area of sort of edtech and e-learning, is this space here is quite often not that heavily populated, and yet that's the area that we talk about an awful lot. Do you see what I mean? And it's a very challenging space to actually engage students in online for any number of reasons. For example, a lot of students are uncomfortable with you diving into their Facebook area. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but there's a debate as to whether you should or not. Another interesting fact that we find that's been found in previous research as well, but we're rediscovering is, for example, most younger students will communicate with us via email, because email is what you use when you talk to old people. Okay, so so you might say, hey, let's all get in Facebook and IM each other. You might not say that, but if you did say that, a lot of your students would say, no, wait a minute, you're old, so don't we talk to you in email? Okay, so email is for formal communication and quite often jumps a generation, because it's that letter paradigm. So there's all kinds of struggles with engaging in that quadrant that are really interesting and worth kind of picking apart and considering. And I think historically, quite a few of us have kind of dived into that space and found it quite a struggle to actually get something going in terms of the way the curriculum works. Now, this idea of learner-owned literacies. So these would be what I described as learner-owned literacies, okay? So obviously, the web is everywhere. It's the same Google that you're using when you're at home as when you're at work, as when you're learning, etc., okay? So we see the edges of institutions blurring and these kind of traditional sort of geographical distinctions breaking down. So I can use the network anywhere, okay? And so what we see is that learners are developing literacies for themselves on a relatively ad hoc basis out there on the web, okay? And some of them are kind of, some of these literacies are great approaches. And it's tempting to want to sort of say, that's great, let's just copy and paste that from you know, your personal space into an institutional context. That's going to work really well. But it's worth saying that it's very difficult. You know, these literacies are very context-based, okay? So a literacy that a learner has developed for themselves in a relatively ad hoc way in what they consider to be their personal environment is not necessarily going to be able to transpose itself into an institutional context without dying on the way in, okay? Even if, hypothetically, it looks like it ought to work really well. They're quite delicate things, these literacies, in terms of context, okay? So the context is really, really important. And I think, again, this is where I come back to the idea of why I'm tentative about frameworks, is because, I mean, if you think back to that diagram where convenience was far and away the biggest block, okay? People don't tend to develop new ways of doing things unless they have to, okay? So even when it's these dynamic kind of exciting learner-owned literacies out on the web and using Facebook for this, that and the other, and et cetera, most people actually only develop new skills or new modes of engagement if they have to adapt because a given thing happens, okay? So I'll give you some examples. And this is, and so we have this idea of evolution. I like the idea of evolution because if you think about evolution is adaptation because of a shifting environment. Okay, that's one possible interpretation, but you see where I'm going with that. So I'll give you some examples. A lot of the students who have moved country to study actually have quite a resident mode of engagement because, quite simply, they want to keep in touch with people back home. And using social media is the most efficient way to do that, okay? But sometimes what happens is, having shifted modes, that then leaks into the rest of their activity. So there's one student that actually used to blog about her life because it was the most efficient way of keeping her family and friends tuned into what she was doing, but that made her more comfortable about, say, blogging about her studies and being part of a blogging community. There's another kind of situation which I sort of describe as, it's kind of like a social pressure, where people realise that unless they have a Facebook profile, they don't have a social life, okay? Because it sort of goes on in Facebook and they don't hear about what's happening when. So that's another thing that kind of forces people to adapt. And occasionally, it's fair to say, that people will adapt because of what their course requires them to do. So they will start blogging because their course said, you will be assessed on your blogging, okay? And so occasionally people make that shift, not all the time. And what sometimes happens is that students will sort of dip into that resident mode of engagement in quite an instrumental way because there are marks for it. And then as soon as they get the marks, they come back out again. If you see what I mean. Now, I just want to be clear. What I'm not trying to say is that we should be trying to shift everybody from being visitors to being residents, because there are pros and cons to both sort of modes of engagement. But it's interesting that there are these kind of transition points, and we could influence that if we wanted to. So, let's talk about some specifics. Are there any questions at that point? Nope? Okay. Okay, I shall plough on then. So, this is UKU 5, so somebody from in a UK university. And they're talking here about how they use Facebook as a kind of study tool. Now, from what I've seen of our data, the secondary school students use Facebook in a fairly ad hoc sort of way. So I call it emergency collaboration. But I don't think they think of it as an emergency. I think I call it that because I'm old and you probably shouldn't do your homework the night before, okay? I think they just think of it as collaboration. So generally speaking, the night before the assignment has to be in, they jump into Facebook, what on earth's happening for this assignment? And their friends help them out, okay? They don't tend to say that they do the homework in Facebook. They say that they talk about what the homework is, okay, for obvious reasons. Once you start getting it to university level, then these kind of sort of study groups start to form. And I think that's probably because, you know, everybody's incoming, so that the hub, if you like, becomes the subject, because there isn't an existing peer group. So you start seeing these groups coalescing around a sort of subject area in Facebook. And I think quite a lot of this goes on. And you can also see how you get this slightly uncomfortable blurring between the sort of learning and the personal, all the rest of it. And a lot of the students that we describe of as predominantly resident say that addiction and distraction is a real problem. I'm thinking of recommending that university libraries deliberately build a room that has no network connectivity in it. So you just cannot get on the network even if you tried, because I think it would be packed with students who know that as soon as they get online, they're going to be drawn into Facebook. Because we know that, generally speaking, people will have whatever they're doing for their studies on one tab and Facebook in another, okay? So these worlds are kind of overlapping. They're not distinct. I mean, we ask students, how much time do you spend online a week? And some of them say, well, it'd be easier to answer you, well, sometimes I'm asleep. Does that count? And then we ask them, how much time do you spend, how much of that time would you say you spend learning, and how much of that time would you spend being social? And they say, I can't answer that question. I don't know where the line is, because I'm always doing both. Okay, yes? You'll have to wait for the microphone, I think.
Okay, I'm trying to locate this quote within your framework of visitor residence.
Yeah.
And I see both behaviors there.
Yeah.
I don't know if we agree with that. I see a visitor behavior because this person goes in order to get what they're going to get, and then they go out.
Yeah.
But also there is a resident behavior because somebody is there and they participate in a way in a compulsory kind of mode because they have to do it. However, probably the engagement is quite difficult.
Yes,
Am I interpreting this in the right way?
Yeah, and I think that we get lots of these kind of mixed up areas, and it's a question as to, I mean, we tried to split it up by whether it was an intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, but even that becomes a bit muddied. I think what I'd say about this is that it's something to do with when you... What's your system for getting hold of relevant information, okay? Do you go to content in terms of that idea of this neutral, objective, book on a shelf type or website content directly? Do you go to a person, hello person, expert, please tell me about this? Or, and this is an area that I think we struggle to kind of build in, do you go to a person via technology? So this is a situation whereby you've got somebody they're trying to find a piece of information out, and to do it, they want to talk to people, and to find people, they're going to the place of the web. Do you see what I mean? And that's kind of that idea of the third place. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's somewhere in the middle, and a lot of stuff ends up somewhere in the middle. And that's why it's a continuum, not two boxes. So yeah, we see this kind of thing sort of happening. And this comes from a blog post where Anne-Marie Cunningham was saying, well, as teachers, should we dive into Facebook or not? And it's controversial as to, you know, it's undecided. You just shook your head very specifically.
I thought about it.
Okay.
I am in Facebook. I'm mostly maybe a visitor.
Okay.
I've started these things just the last 6 months. And I've made a very conscious decision that I will not become friends with anybody who is under 24.
Okay.
Because they put all sorts of postings there, and I want to be informed from newspapers, the LSE and other institutions. I want to get information through their Facebook, and then I have these youngsters, some relatives usually, they say that I had coffee and my dog barks and stuff like that. I don't need this because I'm bombarding with information. Plus, will you have thought, I mean, if the students are talking about their homework on Facebook, it's probably the Facebook is taking the place of the dormitory room. Will we go in there? We wouldn't.
Yes, I think in some ways I agree with you. I think it's a tricky area, but I call the kind of diving into Facebook, I call the listening into the conversation down the pub problem. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there are plenty of places on campus where students go and have a bit of a chit-chat, and if you appeared, the conversation would stop. And in some ways, that can be Facebook. It probably depends on the context of which bit of Facebook. And Facebook is most of the web for a lot of people, okay? So it's worth talking about. But it's also worth remembering that Facebook is no single thing, okay? It is a collection of different ways of connecting and communicating and distributing content and creating networks, okay? So, for example, the predominant form of communication that we see in our data is private messaging via social media. And again, we get a bit of a visitor-resident mix-up there. Because what you've got is you've got people who are in a social media space, but most of the time they use it like email, okay? So when just going back on that idea that emails for talking to old people, it's not that younger people aren't emailing each other. They're doing it via private message. They're using the same paradigm, but they're using private messaging in Facebook. Do you see what I mean? And it's worth remembering that, I say it's worth remembering, I have no evidence for this, so let me frame that differently. I suspect that the majority of communication in Facebook is actually private. So what you see, what's visible, whether you're connected as friends or just visible, is the tip of, potentially, it could be the tip of an iceberg. Obviously, I don't have that data. I mean, I use the metaphor of what you can see in Facebook is the front parlour of the web, I said, you know, because it's the place where you meet and greet people. It's the place where you put the nicest pictures of yourself, where you talk about the books that you don't talk about the Jackie Collins book that you read in Facebook or in Twitter. You talk about Proust and things like that. So perhaps that's just my network, and perhaps I need to follow some different people. Anyway, I distracted myself. So, what's my point? My point is that I think, yes, I think I agree with you. I think it's something that you just have to be very careful to think through. And we do represent authority, however, you know, casual we think we are. And if you appear, as you say, I think that's a good metaphor. If you appeared in the dormitory or in the study group in the coffee time and say, "Hey kids, how's it going?" Then so. Sometimes I do that to my children just to annoy them, but that's a separate issue. So yes, but there's another point in here which is to do with us as institutions not being clear on this issue, okay, which is what is the difference between collaboration and plagiarism? One of the reasons that secondary school students won't tell me that they do their homework in Facebook is because they suspect it's wrong or cheating, okay? One of the reasons, as in that previous quote, which comes from a university student, is it okay to share exam questions visibly in Facebook? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. And obviously, this is a kind of blurry line. Personally, I think that we need to at least convene a discussion around what the difference between collaboration and plagiarism is, because what we're doing is we're pushing potentially really healthy forms of learning sort of underground. Okay, so students will prefer to have little secret private Facebook groups rather than have an open discussion, because why risk one of your academics wandering past and going, actually that's plagiarism? Now when it comes to text and traditional assessment and citation, we can be relatively clear about what plagiarism is, but when it comes to these kind of opportunities to collaborate, we're not clear, we don't talk about it, and everybody's a little bit nervous about it. So when it comes to information, the students that are least equipped are in the biggest jungle. When it comes to collaboration, we're not necessarily all that clear about the line here, which is a bit of a shame. And I think what that does is, as I say, it pushes certain forms of engagement underground. Now I use this phrase, which is really divisive and probably a bit over the top, but I think in terms of collaboration you do create this, it's probably not a black market, it's like a grey market or what have you, is that we're sort of accidentally pushing some of these activities, some of these learner-owned literacies, some of what I think are potentially highly effective modes underground because of not being clear about where the dividing line is on certain things. Now, so that's to do with Facebook, that's to do with collaboration. When it comes to information, what I'm about to do is I'm about to talk about Wikipedia a fair amount, but I'm only using Wikipedia as an exemplar of non-traditional sources of information, okay? So Wikipedia is, quite rightly, the sort of poster boy and whipping boy of the web on this subject. And we find that students talk about it quite a bit. But I wouldn't want you to imagine that I'm just talking about Wikipedia. I'm using it as an example. So here's an interesting quote from a university level student in America. Okay. Now you might, I don't know what level students you're engaging with teaching with, okay, so this situation kind of falls away as students go up through their academic career. But it's fair to say that if you're learning a new subject, Wikipedia is a brilliant starting point, okay. And it's worth remembering that if you're 17, 18, 19, 20, you spend a lot of your time learning new things for the first time, and therefore you end up at Wikipedia, and it's a great starting point, okay? But, and this is one of the most obvious cultural splits that we've got between the US and the UK data, is that in America, they absolutely loathe Wikipedia. They really, really, I don't think it's too strong to say that they hate it. Okay, and I've got quotes, you know, do you get in trouble if you use Wikipedia? No, but you get ridiculed in front of the class, things like that. So essentially you get pointed at and laughed at if you cite Wikipedia in the US. I have a theory that it's got something to do with, you know, our cultural acceptance of amateurism and America having a much more particular idea of expertise.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, do it. Good.
I just couldn't resist challenging you here.
Yeah, no, good.
It might be something to do with discipline as well. As a
It could be.
lawyer,
Yeah.
every time I see a student quote Wikipedia, I almost retch.
Right.
It is not a good source.
Okay.
And I will disabuse anybody that says it is in this context.
Okay.
Because
what's the context?
the context is, if there is open participation, how do you actually identify veracity, cogency, credibility, all the things that aspiring lawyers need?
Yes. I would refer the Honourable, etc., back to my early point about the difference between academia and teaching and learning. Okay? So what you're describing is something that's to do with the academic process of being a lawyer. Because what you said is you want to establish veracity, okay?
No, it's not just the process of being a lawyer. It's actually how, in academic circles, as well as teaching and learning circles, we identify appropriate practices.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that what you call appropriate, I call academia, not necessarily learning. So my point is that you can learn an awful lot from Wikipedia, and students do. Now, whether you think that that's a legitimate or illegitimate activity is not to say that they won't learn in a valuable way from Wikipedia.
No, but what I'm asking is whether this concern is disciplinary.
I think that, yes, there would be different emphasis in different disciplines.
My friend concedes.
That was mean. Okay, well, that was interesting. That's a whole new experience. I might, yeah, when I say I want people to chip, no, it's fine. No, you make it's a very valid point, okay? And the emphasis from an institutional or discipline perspective might change discipline to discipline, okay? The point that I'm making is that whatever you think has veracity or credibility doesn't change the fact that non-traditional sources can be excellent for students to learn stuff from, okay? And that's why I made the distinction between academia and teaching and learning. So I'm not refuting, in fact, I think I'm agreeing with you, but I'm also trying to say something very clever, okay? But quite seriously, that is why I say that at the start, because we're having that discussion, okay, around authority, credibility, and the way it shifts around from different perspectives and in different contexts. And I think it's a very important discussion to have, because otherwise we do create this kind of learning grey or learning black market, whereby I think that students find non-traditional sources very helpful when they want to learn something, but they have to pretend they haven't been there, okay? Well, they would do in the context of your discipline, wouldn't they?
Yes, simply because many of the statements are
Yes, okay, right. Well, that's good. Hold on to that thought, because I'm coming right the way back round to that, okay? I quite like this. This is not a new problem, and I love this guy. It's not very good from a research methodology point of view. USU 12 is just completely blunt and open with what he does. And maybe that's not new. Perhaps we've all gone to a source and then looked at their bibliography and just chucked some of them in as well, okay? But I think that the point is that if we do push these non-traditional sources underground, then this sort of practice is going to take place anyway. So we might as well get used to the idea that students are using these things and tackle this and make it visible and tackle it kind of head on, whatever your opinion is, okay? I need to speed up a little bit. Oh, just quickly before we come back round to Wikipedia, I just want to emphasise that that whole information jungle thing is not entirely to do with younger students or early career sort of in their education. This is a biological scientist, I think, in her 50s, very visitory, if you like, in America. And what she's saying is, and this sort of harks back to perhaps this idea of new forms of digital scholarship, is she's saying, well, actually, I don't necessarily get the best stuff out of journals anymore. I stumble across it in random blogs, but that's quite distressing because I only find it by accident. Who's curating this stuff? What if I miss something that's really good, okay? And so I just wanted to chuck that in there to say, actually, these kind of shifting situations, because of these new forms of information and new forms to engage, actually put all of us in interesting positions, okay? It's not just our kind of students that are trying to learn how to critically evaluate things. This is a very experienced researcher who's finding their own sort of flavour of the same sort of challenge. Now, okay, I'm actually getting to a point where I'm going to round up fairly soon. This is where it gets really interesting for me, okay? Because this is where we have to start to question what we're actually up to. So, and again, I'm using Wikipedia as an exemplar, not necessarily just specifically talking about Wikipedia. But when people say, and I know that you'd argue this point, which is fair enough, that it's not a good idea to use these non-traditional sources or sources like Wikipedia. Normally they say because it's inaccurate, okay? In actual fact, I think a more interesting challenge is this one, okay? Which is not specifically that it's inaccurate, but it's too easy, okay? Now this is the kind of, well, I don't know, is it? This could be the kind of no pain, no gain approach to education, the kind of Protestant work ethic hits university problem. Okay. But I think there's something else, and all I want to do is propose this as an idea. I don't particularly want to try and, I'm not trying to put together a rock-solid argument here, but I'm posing a kind of question. I think that perhaps a lot of our pedagogy is implicit in it is the idea that information is quite difficult to get hold of or takes a certain amount of effort to get hold of. So it takes a certain amount of effort to find an answer or to find a source and then work out whether you need another source and what that one should be and how they link, and that takes a certain amount of effort. And a side effect of that effort is that you learn, okay? Now, the problem now is that if I want to find an answer to something, generally speaking, up to a certain level in my education, I can find it just like that, okay? And I read papers from teachers who say that the assignments from their students are full of correct answers, but there doesn't seem, no learning seems to have taken place, all right? So this comes from a school-level student in the UK. That's the only problem, just knowing what information to use and why, okay? Or what I call learning, right? Now, here's an interesting thing that I think is creeping around in our data, okay? We ask our students, if you had a magic wand, at which point some of them snigger, what would your ideal thing be to help you learn? And some of them say, I want my teacher to appear so I can have a chat with them. Or one really sweet one said, well, if I was learning about relativity, I'd want Einstein to appear. And why not, if you had a magic wand? Okay, so some people sort of say, I want the expert right next to me. Most of the students describe a perfect version of Google. Okay, so they say, what I want is technology that allows me to, that gives me the right answer without me having to worry about it perhaps giving me an irrelevant or slightly wrong answer. So I want a Google that gives me exactly what I want. So i.e. the technology, but sort of perfect. So here's the thing, okay? what we call research, many students see as just simply a failing in the technology. So what you have to do because the technology doesn't work quite well enough yet. Okay? Now, if you go with that idea and then link it with what I was saying in the previous slide, then you end up with an interesting problem. Okay? In terms of this desire, somehow in our education system, we do tend to drive towards the idea that the point is to find the right answer, and when you've found the answer, you're done. Okay, so obviously I'm getting into muddy territory here, but you can see the kind of area. This is why I want to pose it as a question. This last slide, you'll be pleased to know, comes from a really good paper called something like Teaching Social Science with and in Spite of Wikipedia. And here's the good news, I think, is because of what the web affords in terms of places where the students can collaborate and connect with each other, and because of what the web affords in terms of there being reasonably good sources to information that are much more immediate than they used to be. Because of that, it allows us, it gives us the opportunity to shift the way that we teach back into uncertainty and complexity. So I think rather than necessarily having, rather than necessarily seeing this as a threat or a danger, which a lot of you won't, but rather than seeing it that way, I think I see it as an opportunity to turn everything into questions, if you see what I mean, rather than have our pedagogy being about answers. And yes, I went a bit truth and beauty on you at the end there, but that's what I believe, and I think that's what's coming out of our data. Okay. Now, that's where I officially finish. Okay. But I just want to come back on what you were saying. Is that okay? Okay, so we're going to transition smoothly into just a little while for questions, because we've been going for a while, and I don't want to keep people here if they imagine that we were going to go for an hour. Okay, so what this guy did with his school-level students was he said, instead of writing me an assignment on a subject, go to a Wikipedia page on a subject that you know something about and critique what's wrong with it. Okay? That's an excellent example of the kind of flip in pedagogy that I'm talking about. And if you feel confident, then improve the Wikipedia page, okay? We are part of a vast, global, wonderful knowledge information society, commons, etc., source of brain power and all of the rest of it. And so my overall response to you would be, if you think it's rubbish, then make it better. Some of the things that we see as an apparent failing in what the web offers us is actually an opportunity to do more of what we signed up to do. So I think ultimately it's really, really good news in terms of our approach. Now, how you go about doing that with your students in your discipline, in your context, is the tricky part, because it's going to be different in different contexts with different students. So I'm not going to say there's a right way of doing that, but I just think the principle that's at stake here is a great one, because to me, that is higher education. It's interesting that came out of a secondary school in America, not out of higher education. Okay, I'll stop there and take some questions. Is that?
Please do, Dave.
Yeah, okay.
Question just there.
So your last slide there, and also what you've been saying about the way that questions are coming back from the internet, prompts the next set of research, which would be how does the technology affect the questions that are being asked? Have you done any
No,
work?
I mean, I'd like to sort of move on to that and sort of go into it's not more pragmatic, but I think we should sort of shift from social science to pedagogic design in some ways. The way that I look at that is, and this is a very blunt way of thinking about it, if the answer to your question is a Wikipedia page, it's probably not worth asking the question, because the learning might not take place. It will do for some students. So that's where I'm coming from at the moment, is check your pedagogy, and if the answer, if what you require of your students is ultimately a Google search and a quick scan around a few non-traditional sources and a few copy and paste, perhaps you need to think about taking a different approach. And as I mentioned earlier, personally, I think that moving from consuming knowledge from the web to critiquing the knowledge that is on the web is a healthy move. And after all, you know, what we were supposed to be doing with books. Anyway. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment on this last slide and the comment you make about Wikipedia. I had my education in Greece in a time where there were no books. And our lecturers were providing handwritten notes. They didn't have spent much time editing. So they were full of mistakes. That was the best learning experience for me because I was trying to correct their mistakes. This is how I learned. Not from books who had answers.
And I think that's a great example. I mean, you know, when I put that slide up that says I knew the internet wouldn't give me a wrong answer, sometimes I follow it with a slide, because sometimes a room full of people will snigger, if you like, because it seems like such a ridiculous idea. But then if I put the next slide up, sometimes I say, I knew the library wouldn't give me a wrong answer. Is that funny or not? Do you know what I mean? Because what's the point of the library? Is it supposed to contain a bunch of right answers? I don't know. I actually have had a conversation with a couple of librarians and said, as a librarian, do you think it's your job to fill the library up with correct answers? And some of them sort of go, yeah, kind of. So, you know, I mean, what I've been talking about is digital technology, but in some ways, a lot of what I've been discussing is actually just sort of inherent in what higher education is all about. But I absolutely agree with you. We should be critiquing weaknesses in information rather than just going, well, that's not reliable. That doesn't seem like such a bizarre approach to me, but as soon as people go to the web, they become hypercritical of whether it's right or wrong. And I think it's kind of a slightly defensive mode. Perhaps it isn't. I mean, as I say, the students who are in the most treacherous position in terms of information are the least well equipped. And so it's certainly our job to equip them with the ability to be able to say, this isn't correct, I think this is correct, I'm going to find a different source. But I don't know how directly we go about doing that. Yeah.
Something from Twitter. Sorry, there's something from Twitter. This is from Matt Lingard, City University. It says, this is kind of covers the whole of your talk, really. What do universities and teachers need to do to accommodate these visitors and residents that you've talked about?
Well, I suppose being clear about how far your institution travels into the resident space and setting student expectations from that point of view. So, as I say, in terms of the curriculum, universities tend to act in a fairly visitory sort of mode. But everything else to do with the university, the bars, the clubs, the society, is all very resident, okay? Even lectures are quite, like this is fairly resident, okay? But in terms of accommodating students is to not forget how efficient that visitor mode is, and the fact that most students' expectation is that you will engage with them on a visitor basis. And if you're ploughing into the resident area, just to really think it through in terms of that, what you were saying earlier, and not doing the equivalent of appearing in the dorm room. And I don't think I can give a specific advice in terms of dorm rooms, but because that would be dangerous. But you just have to go carefully in terms of attempting to take advantage of those learner-owned literacies in that personal space. And I suppose the last thing I'd say about that is I think the secret to it is working with those literacies but not attempting to own them. So universities, as with any institution, intrinsically try and own things. And I think if we're going to work in terms of taking advantage of the culture of the web and these learner-owned literacies, is we have to find a way of working with them but not owning them. So for example, if you convened a discussion with your students about how they go about learning online, if you just literally said to them, actually, some of what you're doing is quite good, that works really well, that would make a massive difference to them, because you'd be validating literacies which they're worried are illegitimate. You see what I mean? And if you said, actually, some of them are quite good, but you might want to think about this, you know, I think that would go a long, long way. It doesn't have to be, let's all get into Facebook and let's all get thousands of Twitter followers. It can be as simple as saying, okay, that's a reasonable way to work. Let's you know, talk about that. We don't have to be plugging in big complicated bits of technology or diving into Twitter necessarily. It could just be and making those practices more visible and saying it's okay to kind of discuss this stuff and to talk about whether that would work or not, I don't know. But anyway. Are we...
I have a question about
yeah.
Your initial differentiation between academia, learning and teaching. And I have certain reservations about that, but I accept what you are saying. This differentiation can be a bit dangerous, because if we go back to your digital literacies discussion, probably digital literacies has to do with equipping the students with those skills they need in order to evaluate information.
Yeah, it's part of it, yeah.
So if they come across a dodgy source in Wikipedia, they will be able to judge whether it's of good quality or not. So did you think that probably the ability to evaluate web sources, including Wikipedia articles, is a fundamental aspect of this digital literacies kind of framework?
Yeah, I think that it's quite usefully split into 3 areas. So you have tools, skills, i.e. I can switch a computer on and Google, and then you have critical evaluation skills is kind of the next layer. I mean, I'm walking into a framework here if I'm not. And then you have things like social engagement, for example. So I think it does go in those kind of layers. In terms of what I said about academia and teaching and learning, a good example of what I mean is the citation systems. So one of the reasons why people don't like talking about Wikipedia is it's quite difficult to cite because you can't pin it on a single person, all right? And I think an interesting thing to consider in terms of the way these things overlap is that problem of citation, because if you go to the citation guidelines or standards like Harvard or Chicago or what have you, they do have mechanisms for citing websites and blogs and YouTube videos and stuff like that. But kind of within the culture of academia, they're never as good as a book, okay? They aren't. And students know that if they submit a piece of work and the bibliography is all web pages and blog posts, it will be looked down upon, no matter what the quality of those things are, because of the way that we frame the idea of authority of information. And to me, that seems a shame, because in theory, what should happen is, and obviously we don't have the time to do it, is you should go to those blog posts and see if they're any good. Okay? One of the major criteria that learners have in terms of whether they think a source is valid is whether the URL looks legitimate. Okay? So if it says oxac up at the end of it, fine, stick it in, because it looks great in the bibliography, nobody's going to click through. Okay? That's what that Wikipedia guy was saying. I blog under oxac up. I could say any old nonsense, okay? So in sometimes I do. So in some ways, our adult normative ways of assessing authority are really kind of stymieing students' learning. And so it's that kind of territory that I'm talking about. I mean, literally, and I'm going to try this out point blank, but I think if you say to a lot of students, okay, what's better, citing a book or something on the web? Then they'll say, a book, okay, because the authority is still in the book. In fact, one student said that books were primary sources and the web was secondary sources. The web is not a genre. It is a means of distribution. But in academia, sometimes we think of it as a genre of information, which is incorrect. So, if I said to a student, okay, what's better, a book or a web page? They'll say a book. I say, okay, I'm going to scan the book in, I'm going to put it on a website. What's better? They'll say, the book. So what's that, where does that leave us? And I think it leaves us, if I'm totally honest, in a situation where we're still tied to outmoded notions of authority and quality in information, which is unfortunate. So it's all those kind of issues that I'm trying to get to.
Dave, that's great. Is that?
It's just kind of follows on from that same point. So if I could
Just yes, sure, please. Then we'll wind up. That's okay.
Just following in on that point, it ties into something that was also asked on Twitter from Eleni Zazani, who asked who's curating all this science that appears in blogs and things like that. And I think what the question with her question, what that's raised for me is this idea of persistence. That if you cite something that's on a blog post, how do you know that blog post will be there in 5 years' time? Whereas the book somehow is forever. When you cite a book, you will somehow be able to get hold of a copy of that book.
But only if they digitise it and put it online, ironically. But yes, what I mean is that the book will vanish from the library. I've heard librarians say, okay, in the last few years, I'll just do this very quickly, that it used to be the case that librarians would say, I think it's probably okay to have computers in the library. I have heard librarians stand up and say, I think it's probably okay if we keep some books in the library. That flip has taken place. We've got one student who doesn't talk about books, he talks about hard copy sources. So to him, a book is part of the internet that somebody's inconveniently printed out, okay? A complete cultural flip. But in answer to your question, yes, there is that idea that the web is somehow ephemeral. I'm not convinced that it's any more ephemeral than a physical book, necessarily. And I'm not convinced that that gets at the heart of what I'm talking about in terms of authority and quality of information. But, I mean, it's a reasonable point. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Dave, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. I think the questions you've raised do actually throw light on a number of issues we've been grappling with, from the way some people see the use of VLEs as somehow pre-packaging knowledge and making it too easy, through some of the difficulties we've had in introducing and using social software in a learning and teaching context. Quite rightly, you didn't attempt to provide the answers except to point to the complexity of the questions which we're addressing and encouraging us to go on and asking questions. So I'd like you to join me in thanking you.